Ever feel like life has gotten a little too complicated? Yeah? Sam's like, yes. Yes. Wouldn't you sometimes like a clear sign to tell you what to do, where to go? Jazz, I know we've had this conversation. She's got some interesting ideas that start back like in middle school. You can talk to her about it. Between keeping all the balls in the air that you're responsible for, all the decisions about your future that kind of feel constantly present because you're in college, it can feel like life can be overwhelmingly complicated. So like Lee said, we've been talking about spiritual disciplines this past month in an effort to open ourselves up more to God's Spirit. That's why we do the disciplines. It's about gaining clarity about what is most important. How do we live faithfully and with purpose? So practicing disciplines like solitude, prayer, which we've talked about, fasting, which we haven't, but is also an interesting discipline. Those are ways to support that kind of discernment. Today's discipline of simplicity, it has that component to kind of gain clarity about what's most important, but it's actually also just a required practice. Living simply is an essential part of what it means to be a Christian. And frankly, these days it is an existential necessity for us, given the realities of climate change. If you read through the scriptures all throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament, you will see God's constant concern for economic justice, which is inextricably intertwined with our current environmental crises. Jesus talks a lot about money and material possessions, and he is very explicit, telling his followers to let it all go, sell it, get rid of it, come follow me. That's what he says. One of his teachings is a scripture passage that Connor read to us from the Gospel of Luke today, and we are going to take a very close look. So grab a Bible, sorry we didn't have it up on the screen. I want you to really follow along. We're in a little Bible study today, so open up to page 847 so that you can follow along, because I know that it was a lot. Sometimes we have short scripture passages. Today was quite a lot. All right, got it? So our story today, it starts out with a family fight. All good stories, right? Some conflict. It's a family fight. One of the members is trying to rope Jesus into the middle of it and get him on his side. So look at verse 13. This is where the man interrupts Jesus in the middle of his teaching, which is bold, and says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." So a little context. The general custom of these times meant that family inheritances, which was almost always land, it was pretty much always land, it was given to the father's sons, as patriarchal society. So this was a way of keeping land in the family, because it assumed that all the brothers would continue to farm the land together. So even though they kind of each got it, they would kind of keep it all together, farm it together. So the fact that this man was asking Jesus to command his brother to divide the family inheritance, that indicated that things had really gone sour in the relationship. The man's request was really a demand to complete the separation, kind of a final F you, as he wants nothing more to do with his brother. So Jesus' response to the man was curt. As he often does, he launches into a parable. So look at verse 16. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. So there are two words, really important words in that sentence. Land and rich. Land is important because it points out that it is not because of the man's intelligence, his hard work, or any of his own merit that he gets a bumper crop. The land simply produces an abundance, and the man is lucky enough to be the owner of it. The second word, rich, that tells us that this man already has more than he needed. This rich man is given even more, so much more that he's presented with a dilemma. So he gets to thinking. Look at verse 17. What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. It's a good question. Wise question to ask. But this is where the problems begin. Notice that he did all his thinking all by himself. In the traditional Middle Eastern culture of this time, people would often spend their time at the village gate, consulting with one another about their business affairs. So farmers would talk to each other about techniques, certain lands, where to sell their crops. Being a part of that community, it wasn't just for the business benefits, however. It also provided accountability. It looked out for the overall well-being of society. So at the village gate, people learned about who was in need, and it was also where farmers could go when they needed some help. The rich man was isolated though, so he had no one to talk to but himself. That also meant he had limited the ability of anyone else to ask him the hard questions about what he was doing. In the process of becoming rich, the rich man had also built a wall around not only his wealth, but himself as well. So, since the man has no one to get ideas from anyone but himself, he comes to his own conclusions. Look at verse 18. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grains and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. At first glance, this seems like a fine plan. He does what any smart investor would do in our society. Instead of spending away all his wealth, he decides to store it up so that he can sell it maybe during a year when there's a shortage of crops, get a higher price. Makes good business sense. But again, the rich man's thinking is problematic. He makes the mistake of assuming that everything is his. So listen again to what he says in verses 18 and 19. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. There I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. The last statement he makes is especially damning, as he has no one to rejoice with but himself. The rich man seems to have alienated everyone around him to the point where only he can appreciate the surplus of goods he has received. In the process of accumulating all his wealth, he has lost something very important: connection with others. It is at this point when God enters into the story and reveals the true state of affairs for the man. Now, there are 4 different words in the New Testament that are used for full. Of the 4, the one that is used here is the strongest. It is a term which you would reserve for when someone did something exceptionally stupid. So verse 20, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? God goes on to tell him that his time is up. His life, which has been on loan from God, is now being demanded. As the man built up his riches alone, he will now also die alone. And who knows what will happen to all of his wealth. There are at least 2 tragedies here. First, that the rich man failed to see how the extra crops could have perhaps been stored in the mouths of the hungry. And second, that in the process of pursuing more wealth, the rich man had cut himself off from others. Before we are too harsh with the rich man, let me just say that I think this folly is not an uncommon one, especially in our American capitalist society. Who of us have not wished that at some point we would win the lottery so that we could eat, drink, and be merry? I know I have. How many of us have said that we just needed to make enough money to be stable before we fulfill the good intentions that we have to give our time, our money, our energy to that general cause? How often do we invest in more storage space, whether that is more boxes, a bigger apartment, bigger house so that we can store our extra crops? The desire to get ahead is tempting because it gives us a sense of security. But it is a false security. It is a false security because we do not ultimately own anything. All we have, including our very lives, those belong to God. And yet, it seems that we cannot stop ourselves from worrying. While most of us are fortunate enough to not have to worry about the next meal, that does not stop us from stressing about not having enough. Jesus knows this tendency and speaks directly to it. Look at verse 22. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to the span of your life? He then moves into this beautiful reflection on God's abundant provision. Consider the ravens, who neither sow nor reap, but have plenty to eat. And consider the lilies that neither toil nor spin, but are splendidly clothed. In other words, if God provides for animals and plants, how much more will God provide for us? For many of us in our community, we may not worry as much about having enough food or clothes. Our worries, I think, are more about holding on to the abundance, if we can recognize it as abundance, that we already have, or maintaining a lifestyle that we have become accustomed to. And we know that Americans live a lifestyle that is not sustainable compared to the rest of the world. The challenge we face is that of the rich man in the parable. Like him, most of us already have more than enough to take care of our basic needs. But we are always on the hunt to not only retain what we have, but to build up larger barns. As we collect more crops, we become more entangled with them. Our time, our energy, and our efforts go towards making sure that the barns are the latest and the best model as we compare what we already have to the bigger and better barns that we see around us. Life starts to get really complicated as we try to manage the barns that we have been busy collecting. And before long, our lives are all about the barn business. This is where the practice of simplicity can help us break free and to prioritize what really matters. Richard Foster is a Christian theologian and author who's written much about spiritual disciplines. He suggested a number of principles to living simply. I've printed them out for you to take home. They are on the little table by the tree, the blue sheets. I invite you to take one as you go down to dinner. They're not surprising things, so much as reminders, I think things that we already know, but concrete reminders of what it means to live simply on a very practical level. The goal is not about following all these principles in this legalistic manner, because I think that would defeat the purpose of the discipline of simplicity. It's really to find freedom from the control that material possessions, that kind of insatiable desire, can have over us. As Jesus pointed out, the cost is great to making material wealth our treasure. It cuts us off from God and others. All throughout scriptures, it's very clear. It may be an obvious truth that where we put the majority of our time and energy reflects our priorities. I think we know that on an intellectual level, but Jesus brings it home when he says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So the invitation then, in this discipline, is to reorient our understanding of what is ours. If everything we have, including our very lives, is a gift from God, then we no longer have to worry about stockpiling our stash, because God will provide abundantly. Jesus encourages us to freely share what is given to us and to let it go for those who need it more. Instead of spending so much time and energy building bigger barns, we are invited to deepen our relationships with God and the people around us. The discipline of simplicity helps us to remember where our true treasure lies. So let's do this together. Let's keep it simple.